what we know from weight class based sports is a huge problem is this concept of low energy availability, where essentially there's not enough calories coming in to support both the training workload and certain essential processes within the body. So what the body does and how it adapts, it has to essentially save energy and turn down energy expenditure from some essential processes. So with female athletes, we see this super commonly where they experience loss of their menstrual cycle, so amenorrhea, which is basically a way of the body to conserve energy by saying, right now I don't need this reproductive function and I'm not getting enough calories in, so I'm just going to turn this off. The same thing happens with immune system function, same thing happens with digestive function, bone health. And so you see this classification of what's now termed relative energy deficiency in sport, is where we have a chronic low energy availability state. You have this manifesting in various different body systems, like I said, whether that's reproductive, bone health, so that means it's increasing risk of like stress fractures or even long-term complications like osteopenia. It's impacting immune system function, so now you have athletes more susceptible to illnesses, and if you're ill, you're either not able to train properly or you're even missing training sessions. They stack up enough over multiple years, you're missing time that you could be getting better at your craft. So there's all these components of low energy availability. And what's important to realize is, sure, we may need to dip into that state during the tail end of times where we're getting super lean or an athlete's cutting weight. That's almost unavoidable. But we don't want that happening chronically over the long term. So when we don't have a fight coming up, making sure we have appropriate energy to fuel all those training sessions and getting plenty of calories coming in is the way to prevent a lot of those downsides, so that the athlete doesn't run into those very real problems.
That's a great point, because when someone is in a caloric deficit for extended periods of time, the body essentially thinks it's under threat, right? It's fighting for survival. So like you said, it's going to start, shutting down some of those 11 systems of the body, or some of those systems are not going to be getting the required nutrients for optimal function. And particularly if you're training 2 to 3 times a day, you're literally robbing from Peter to pay Paul. You're taking that energy away from the body's physiological processes to fuel your training session. Right. So, that's why I wanted to bring up this conversation, the difference between health and performance, because those things really, they kind of go in hand, but they don't as well. So what I mean by that is we want someone to be healthy the majority of the time, so that when it is time to, put the pedal to the floor, now we can start training for performance. Now we can start dialing everything in, and we can go through that 8 to 12 week period of high stress, where we're cutting weight, we're building our strength, speed, power, energy systems, etc. We're sharpening our skills, we're sharpening our axe, and we're reducing our weight as we get closer and closer to the fight. But then on the other side, most people don't have that periodized plan. It's just like, all right, cool, I signed a contract. I don't know how many calories I'm eating. I don't know how many macronutrients I'm having. I'm already training 2-3 times a day. Where do I go from here? They've got to start pulling from somewhere, and that's when you get into a massive calorie deficit, and then you start creating metabolic adaptation. And particularly on the other side of a fight, or, a weight class athlete competing in an event, then on the other side, people haven't been taught how to go through a reverse diet or have essentially a plan to come out of that. They've been restricting for long periods of time. We need to teach them how to come out of the other side. Cool, go and enjoy yourself, okay, but have it for a couple of days. Just understand your digestive system's probably going to be a little bit stressed out, and you're going to be super sensitive to certain things that come into your body, like alcohol, and maybe if you smash a heap of carbs and things like that, it might cause some indigestion and bloating and things like that. Understand that. Have a couple of days to enjoy yourself, but also think like we've got to plan the other side of it, where we start going through a little bit of a reverse diet, and then we start changing our training as well, where we've put our body under a shitload of stress for the last 8 weeks, 12 weeks or whatever. Let's have a plan nutritionally and training wise to come out the other side, so we can start rebuilding those health markers and get ourselves back to a good position. Can you talk about metabolic adaptation?
Sure. So yeah, this is a really important concept to be aware of, and it's Essentially relates to an important aspect of energy balance where calories in influences calories out and vice versa. They don't work as two separate things in an input output machine. They're inextricably tied. So what happens when we either go into an overfeeding or underfeeding state is there is an adaptation by the body as an attempt to kind of maintain some degree of homeostasis, we can think of it. We're trying to balance out that intake and expenditure because in the long term, the body chronically doesn't want to keep losing mass. And it also wants to prevent as much as possible from continually gaining mass, or at least it's set up that way hormonally to be able to try and defend against. And so what happens, for example, when we go into a calorie deficit is as we reduce our caloric intake, there is an impact then on our energy expenditure. So the body will kind of turn down our normal energy expenditure by a certain amount. So this could be contributed from small things like we're obviously eating less food, so there's less thermic effect of feeding, so that the energy we expend to digest food. But most of it is driven by changes in non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So these small movements that we subconsciously do throughout the day that contribute to our energy expenditure can start getting turned down. Now, the bigger the deficit and the longer it goes on, we're going to get a greater metabolic adaptation downwards. So even though an athlete, let's say, drops their calories by 800 compared to their normal maintenance intake, their calorie deficit is probably not going to be exactly 800 because their energy expenditure will have dropped a certain amount. And the longer they go, there's probably going to be a greater adaptation. And so at some point, that deficit is no longer that big. And so this is why over time people see a slowdown in their rate of weight loss, or they need to start changing their diet again or reducing intake again to continue losing at the same degree of weight. And what we also know is that there's a huge degree of inter-individual variation here, that from one person to the next, even two athletes that maintain their body weight on the same number of calories, if we were to reduce their intake both by, let's say, 600 calories per day, there may be a difference in that metabolic adaptation. So in other words, how much their energy expenditure decreases. And so we would see a different response in terms of the rate of weight loss between those two athletes. And the reverse also happens when you go into an overfeeding state. You overfeed beyond your normal habitual intake or what you actually need to maintain weight, and your body can increase its energy expenditure. Some people, there's a bigger increase, some people a smaller increase. And this is why we would see differences in people who overeat by a certain amount, how likely that is to translate to weight gain over a certain period of time. So these are all just adaptive processes by the body to try and account for this over or under feeding. And this is kind of useful that if we think within normal circumstances, let's say we're not trying to overeat or undereat, we don't need to eat the exact number of calories every single day and match it with our energy expenditure to stay the same weight. People stay in and around the same weight for multiple months and years. So it's on this day-to-day fluctuation, the body's able to account for what we've actually consumed in our intake by slightly changing expenditure or having influences on what we're likely to eat the next day. And so that's the adaptive kind of thermogenesis idea of that when we change our calories in, there's going to be an adaptive response by the body to change our calories out.
Yeah, great explanation, mate. And this is why there'll be some fighters listening to this as well. So this is why when people are cutting weight, as they approach a fight and they get closer and closer to that fight, they start cutting more and more calories. They're sleeping between training sessions because their body's literally like, hey, there's not much energy coming in. I need to conserve it. So I'm just going to sleep between training sessions, man.